Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I'm Captain Arthur Hastings, and I'm here to share another extraordinary case from the files of my dear friend, the incomparable Hercule Poirot. Today, we delve into a puzzling affair that began on a gloomy London afternoon, an enigma wrapped in art, ambition, and a peculiar splash of crimson. It was a case that tested even Poirot's celebrated little grey cells and took us through some of the city's most intriguing corners, uncovering secrets hidden not just behind a curtain, but within the very fabric of human deceit. If you appreciate a good mystery, do subscribe to the channel for more tales of detection. Now, let's begin with the first chapter of The Girl Behind the Red Curtain. Chapter 1. The Call to Baker Street. The anachronistic clatter of a hansom cab passing by Poirot's Baker Street flat was often the most exciting sound on a dreary London afternoon. This particular Tuesday, however, even the relentless drizzle outside seemed to possess a certain melancholy gravity. I sat by the window, ostensibly reading the Times, but in truth my gaze drifted to the rain-streaked panes, my thoughts as grey as the sky. Poirot, ensconced in his armchair, was polishing an already gleaming silver frame containing a photograph of the King of Belgium. His famous moustaches, immaculately waxed, twitched faintly with concentration. "Ah, Hastings," he purred, catching my reflective sigh. "The weather, she oppresses you, no? It is a pity for the air. She is ripe with possibilities, even if the sky suggests otherwise." Before I could ponder the philosophical implications of his statement, the sharp peal of the doorbell sliced through the quietude. Georges, Poirot's efficient valet, soon announced Inspector Japp, whose usually jovial face was now drawn and serious. "Poirot, Hastings," Japp greeted, shedding water from his hat onto our Persian rug with characteristic disregard. "Got a nasty one for you. Or rather, I've got one that's got me stumped, and I thought your particular methods might come in handy." Poirot raised a finely sculpted eyebrow, a silent invitation for Japp to elaborate. "It's a young woman," Japp began, settling into the armchair opposite Poirot. "Name of Eleanor Vance. Found lifeless in a small flat off Mayfair. Aspiring actress by all accounts. Not famous, not wealthy, just trying to make her way. And the circumstances, mon ami?" Poirot's voice was calm, yet I detected a quickening of his analytical engine. "Mysterious," Japp admitted with a grunt. "No signs of forced entry, no struggle. She was found in her sitting room, slumped in a chair, a cup of tea on the table beside her. Looks like she just collapsed. Doctor's initial assessment is inconclusive, but he suspects foul play. Something subtle, not immediately obvious. No visible marks, no obvious poison, but the way she's gone, it ain't natural." Poirot nodded, his eyes half closed. "And what precisely makes you stumped, Inspector?" "Well, apart from the lack of an obvious cause of death," Japp continued, running a hand through his thinning hair, "it's the flat itself. Or rather, what isn't there? She was an aspiring actress, right? You'd expect scripts, photographs, letters. But everything was neat, almost too neat. And we found this." Japp produced a small crimson tassel from his coat pocket, along with a crumpled theatre program. The tassel was made of silk, rich in color and texture, ending in a delicate knot. The program was for a play currently running in the West End, The Crimson Orchid. "A theatre program for a play she wasn't even in," Japp explained. "And this tassel looks like it came from a stage curtain, maybe. Odd, eh?" Poirot took the items, turning the tassel over in his nimble fingers, his expression unreadable. "And the landlady, Mrs. Todd, I presume?" "Aye, Mrs. Todd," Japp confirmed. "Nervous old bird. Said Eleanor was a quiet tenant, kept to herself, paid her rent on time. Didn't hear anything out of the ordinary. She's the one who found her this morning when Eleanor didn't answer her knock about the overdue milk bill." Poirot, I don't see how a tassel and a theatre program tell us anything, I ventured, ever the practical one. Poirot merely smiled, a faint, knowing curve of his lips. Ah, Hastings, it is precisely the insignificant details that often scream the loudest. Why a theatre program for a play in which she had no part? Why this particular shade of crimson? And why, in a flat where life was so suddenly extinguished, does everything appear so unnaturally orderly? It offends my sense of symmetry. Let us go, Hastings. I feel a disturbance in the precise mechanism of things. He rose, adjusted his cravat, and with a swift, purposeful movement, donned his overcoat and bowler hat. The rain outside still fell, a relentless curtain of water, but within Poirot's eyes I saw the first flicker of intellectual engagement, a spark that promised to cut through the gloom. The chase was on. Chapter 2. Whispers at the Apollo. The gas lamps of the theatre district fought valiantly against the encroaching twilight as we navigated the throng of pre-theatre goers. The air hummed with anticipation, a stark contrast to the quiet tragedy we had left behind in Mayfair. Poirot, despite the bustle, moved with an almost ethereal calm, his eyes missing nothing. Our destination was the Apollo Theatre, currently staging The Crimson Orchid, the very play mentioned in the crumpled program found with Eleanor Vance. Backstage, the atmosphere was a delightful chaos of hurried stagehands, powdered actors, and the faint, sweet smell of grease paint and dust. Poirot, however, seemed perfectly at home amidst the controlled pandemonium. We had arranged to meet Mr. Silas Blackwood, the play's celebrated, if notoriously temperamental director. He was a man of theatrical flair, with a dramatic sweep of silver hair and an imperious gaze. "So, you wish to inquire about Miss Vance?" Blackwood boomed, his voice resonating even in the cavernous wings. "A tragic affair, certainly. She auditioned for me, you know, for a minor role, a chambermaid. Talented enough, yes, but lacked, what is the word? The spark, the raw, untamed fire. She was too refined, too precise." He paused, adjusting a velvet cuff. "Did not get the part, naturally." "Indeed," Poirot said, his voice deceptively mild. "And yet, a program for your play was found in her possession. A curious detail for one who did not achieve the spark." Blackwood waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, young actresses. They collect programs, you know. Keeps hope alive, I suppose. A memento. There's nothing more to it, I assure you." As we spoke, a striking young woman with fiery red hair and emerald eyes swept past us, her costume rustling. This was Miss Vivian Holloway, the play's ambitious ingenue. She paused, casting a disdainful glance at Blackwood. "Oh, still discussing Miss Vance, are we?" she purred, her voice dripping with a subtle, well-practiced sarcasm. "Such a shame. She did try so hard. Perhaps too hard, if you ask me. Always lurking, always watching. One might almost think she was studying us." "Studying?" Poirot's eyes sharpened. "In what manner, mademoiselle?" "Oh, you know," Vivian said, shrugging her elegant shoulders. "Actors study other actors. But Eleanor, she was always in the background. Not just watching for lines, but for details. The way the light fell, the specific shade of a prop. Rather intense for a chambermaid, wouldn't you say?" Before we could press her further, Blackwood interjected, clearly irritated. "That's quite enough, Vivian. You have a curtain call in 5 minutes. As Vivian flounced off, Poirot's gaze lingered on her retreating figure. Interesting. The spark she lacked, it seems, was not for acting, but for something else entirely. Our next encounter was with Charles Finch, a quiet, unassuming stagehand who was painstakingly polishing a prop dagger. He seemed entirely out of place in the theatrical melodrama surrounding him, his hands calloused, his eyes earnest. "Eleanor Vance, sir." Finch spoke in a low, respectful tone. I remember her. She was often here, even after the auditions. Never bothered anyone, just observed. Said she was looking for inspiration for her other work. Other work? I repeated, intrigued. Aye. She dabbled in painting, I heard. Used to sketch things she saw around the theatre. Once, she asked me about the specific red paint we used on the main curtain for the Crimson Orchid. Very particular she was about the shade. This detail caught Poirot's attention. The main curtain, the one from which a tassel was found. Precisely, sir. A very distinct Venetian red, we call it. Quite expensive. She was fascinated by it, and she had some peculiar sketches, not for our play, I don't think. More old-fashioned, like something out of a history book. Finch hesitated. And she was with a gentleman a few times. Older, distinguished. Never saw his face clearly, always in the shadows. Poirot's eyes narrowed, a glint of triumph in their depths. The red curtain begins to draw back, Hastings. This other work of Miss Vance. These old-fashioned sketches, and a mysterious gentleman. Inspector Japp may have dismissed the tassel, but it appears Mademoiselle Vance was not just an aspiring actress, but an artist with a secret canvas, perhaps one painted in that very specific shade of Venetian red. Chapter 3. The Artist's Retreat. Our pursuit of Eleanor Vance's other work led us to the bohemian labyrinth of Chelsea, far from the glittering marquees of the West End. The air here was redolent with turpentine and linseed oil, and the streets were lined with quaint, if somewhat dilapidated, art studios. We found ourselves outside a tall, narrow house, its windows streaked with years of dust and grime, which served as the studio of Professor Alistair Vance, Eleanor's art tutor and, as it turned out, a distant relative. The professor, a stooped elderly man with a wild shock of white hair and a mournful gaze, received us with a quiet dignity. "Eleanor, my dear girl," Professor Vance murmured, his voice thick with grief as he ushered us into a cluttered studio. Canvases in various states of completion leaned against every available surface, and the scent of oil paint was almost overwhelming. Such a tragedy. She had a rare talent, you know, a meticulous eye, a steady hand. Far more than just an aspiring actress. She was pursuing painting seriously, then? Poirot asked, his gaze sweeping over the chaotic room, noting the diverse styles and subjects. Oh, yes. She came to me for guidance. She had a keen interest in historical techniques, the old masters. She spent hours in here, often late into the night. We were working on a particularly challenging project just before she was taken. Professor Vance gestured vaguely towards an easel draped with a linen cloth. Poirot approached the easel with an almost reverential air, then gently lifted the cloth. Beneath it was a half-finished portrait. It was indeed a striking piece, but what caught my eye was its peculiar style. It was not a modern work, but seemed to emulate a much older period, perhaps the Renaissance, yet with a distinctly contemporary subject. A woman with an enigmatic smile, her hand resting on what appeared to be a rich crimson fabric. The colors were vibrant, the detail exquisite. She was attempting a copy? Poirot inquired, his tone carefully neutral. Professor Vance sighed. Not precisely a copy, more of an homage, an exploration. She was fascinated by the concept of artistic secrets, the hidden messages in great works. This particular piece was her own challenge. She was convinced that certain masters incorporated subtle codes, visual clues to historical events or even other paintings. The reds, you see, were her particular focus. She called this the girl behind the red curtain. Poirot leaned closer, his magnifying glass appearing as if by magic. He examined the brush strokes, the texture of the canvas. The pigments, Professor, they are unusual, particularly this deep crimson. Ah, yes, Venetian red, Vance confirmed, a flicker of professional pride in his eyes. Difficult to work with, but the color, the depth, Eleanor sought it out herself, insisted upon its authenticity for this piece, said it was essential to the truth she was trying to reveal. He then pointed to a small, almost imperceptible inscription on the back of the canvas, etched into the wood of the stretcher. It read simply, "Lapis lazuli gate." "Lapis lazuli gate," I repeated, mystified. What could that mean? A whimsical artistic flourish, perhaps, Vance suggested, though his eyes seemed to dart away from Poirot's direct gaze. Eleanor had her peculiar inspirations. Leaving Professor Vance, Poirot insisted on a brief detour to the British Museum, where we sought out Mr. Edmund Thorne, an art critic known for his encyclopedic knowledge and equally sharp tongue. We found him in a quiet reading room, hunched over ancient texts. He was a gaunt man, with severe spectacles and a dismissive air. "Eleanor Vance," Thorne sniffed without looking up. Yes, I knew of her. A promising talent, perhaps, but too easily swayed, too enamored with the romantic notion of lost art. She had a passion for a particular historical mystery. Something about a stolen Medici painting, if I recall. Utter nonsense, of course. All sensation, no substance. She believed it to be utter nonsense. Poirot probed. No, I believed it to be nonsense. She, on the other hand, was convinced there was a great secret waiting to be uncovered, said she was on the verge of proving it. Silly girl, lost herself in a fantasy. Thorne finally looked up, fixing us with a cynical stare. What does any of this have to do with her unfortunate demise? Everything, Monsieur Thorne, Poirot stated, his voice ringing with quiet conviction. For a silly girl with a fantasy appears to have stumbled upon a truth so profound, it cost her life. The red curtain deepens, Hastings. It seems Eleanor was not merely painting a portrait, but uncovering a hidden chapter of art history, one that someone wished to remain eternally veiled. Chapter 4. Riverside Shadows. The thick yellow fog that often shrouded London in the colder months had descended upon the city, lending an eerie, ethereal quality to the winding streets of Wapping. The Thames, a murky serpent, was barely visible through the mist, and the air was heavy with the smell of coal smoke, damp earth, and decaying fish. We were far from the genteel precincts of Chelsea and Mayfair, in a district of grimy warehouses and shadowy alleyways, following a trail of unusual art supplies. A most unpicturesque locale for artistic pursuits, n'est-ce pas, Hastings? Poirot remarked, picking his way carefully over the slick cobblestones, his patent leather shoes surprisingly adept on the treacherous surface. Our inquiries had led us to a grimy establishment known as Griggs Curios and Pigments, a ramshackle shop nestled between a chandlery and a particularly unsavory public house. The shop was dark and cluttered, filled with an eclectic mix of antique odds and ends and shelves overflowing with jars of pigments, brushes, and various artistic paraphernalia. The air was thick with the scent of chemicals and dust. Mr. Griggs himself was a corpulent man with shifty eyes and a nervous twitch, who seemed more accustomed to dealing in stolen goods than legitimate art supplies. He regarded us with unconcealed suspicion, particularly when Poirot introduced himself as a detective. "Eleanor Vance," Griggs wheezed, wiping his hands on a greasy apron. "Aye, she was in here a few times. Strange young lady, not the usual sort for these parts. Always asking for the most particular things." "Particular in what way, Monsieur Griggs?" Poirot inquired, his voice calm, yet insistent. "Oh, special pigments, you know. Not your everyday watercolors. Always the rare stuff, rare earth oxides, historical dyes. And that Venetian red she was so keen on. Said she couldn't find its exact shade anywhere else in London." Griggs rummaged beneath his counter, eventually producing a crumpled, ink-stained receipt. "Here, see? Just last week. Paid a pretty penny for it, she did." The receipt clearly listed a substantial purchase of various pigments, including a large quantity of Venetian red, authentic, from Venice. It was dated just 2 days before Eleanor Vance was found lifeless. "Did she come alone on this occasion?" Poirot asked, his gaze fixed on Griggs. The dealer hesitated, his eyes darting nervously. "No, not always. Sometimes she had a gentleman with her, older, well-dressed, but kept to the shadows like. Never spoke much, just observed. Paid in cash, always." "Could you describe this gentleman, Monsieur Griggs?" I interjected, trying to pin down the elusive figure. Griggs wrung his hands. Tallish, distinguished. Wore a dark hat. Couldn't see his face clear, mind you. But he seemed important. Like someone who knew what they were about, if you catch my meaning. Had an air of authority. As we left Griggs' shop, the fog seemed to thicken, pressing in around us. Poirot was unusually silent, his mind evidently working at speed. We passed a group of dock workers taking a break outside a bustling pub, their faces ruddy from the cold. One of them, a burly man named Thomas, recognized Poirot, having once given a statement in a minor shipping fraud case. "Afternoon, Mr. Poirot," Thomas grunted, tipping his cap. "Out here in this muck again, are you?" Poirot smiled politely. "Indeed, my friend. I wonder, have you by any chance seen a young lady, artistic-looking, perhaps in the company of an older gentleman, around these parts recently?" Thomas scratched his chin, his brow furrowed in thought. I might have, now that you mention it. A pretty lass she was, and that old geezer with her. A right toff he was. Stood out a mile in these parts. Not the sort you see buying paint from Griggs. Held himself like a lord, he did. Saw them heading in the direction of Lord Ashworth's estate not long ago. My jaw dropped. Lord Ashworth. An aristocrat, a patron of the arts, but also a figure whispered about in certain circles for his less than scrupulous acquisition of lost masterpieces. The pieces were beginning to fit, albeit in a most unsettling manner. "Lord Ashworth," Poirot murmured, a flicker of triumph in his eyes. "The red curtain leads us not just to a canvas, Hastings, but to the darker, more shadowy corners of the art world. It seems Mademoiselle Vance was not merely painting with Venetian red, she was painting with danger, and her palette was tragically complete." Chapter 5. An aristocratic affair. The grand, imposing facade of Lord Ashworth's Mayfair estate rose majestically from the swirling fog, a stark contrast to the gritty docklands we had just left. Here, the gas lamps glowed with a softer, more refined light, illuminating meticulously manicured hedges and gleaming brass. The very air seemed to smell of wealth and old money. The contrast was deliberate, Poirot noted, a careful cultivation of an image. Lord Ashworth, a man whose charm was as polished as his silver hair, received us in his opulent drawing-room, a veritable museum of art and antiquities. He was impeccably dressed, his manner courteous, yet with an undercurrent of barely concealed condescension. "Hercule Poirot," Lord Ashworth purred, extending a languid hand. "A pleasure, if somewhat unexpected. To what do I owe this intriguing visit?" Poirot, unperturbed by the thinly veiled sarcasm, stated his purpose plainly. "We are investigating the unfortunate demise of Miss Eleanor Vance. We have reason to believe she had some acquaintance with your lordship." Lord Ashworth's smile wavered only slightly. "Eleanor Vance? Ah, yes. A delightful young woman. An aspiring artist, I believe. Professor Vance, her tutor, occasionally brings promising students to my attention. I am, after all, a patron of the arts. I recall her visiting, yes, a few times, perhaps, to view my collection, seek inspiration. Nothing more substantial, I assure you. She was seen, however, in your lordship's company near the docks, acquiring certain unusual pigments," Poirot pressed, his eyes fixed on Ashworth. Ashworth chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "Docks? My dear Poirot, I assure you, my art purchases are conducted through the most reputable channels. And as for accompanying a young artist on such an errand, I fear you have been misinformed, or perhaps mistaken me for another." Just then, Lady Ashworth entered the room, a petite woman with nervous eyes that seemed to dart perpetually. She offered us a fragile smile before retreating to a quiet corner, where she began to nervously arrange a vase of flowers. She seemed to observe us from the periphery, her silence almost more eloquent than Ashworth's practiced denials. Poirot's gaze, however, was already drifting towards a particular painting on the wall, a miniature portrait, exquisitely detailed, but so small it was almost lost amidst the grandeur of its larger companions. It depicted a woman dressed in period attire, standing before a rich crimson curtain. The style, though refined, struck me as uncannily similar to Eleanor Vance's unfinished portrait. "This piece, Lord Ashworth," Poirot said, gesturing toward the miniature. "It is most intriguing, the style, the use of colour, particularly the Venetian red. It reminds me of Miss Vance's work." Ashworth followed Poirot's gaze. "Ah, that. A minor piece, acquired years ago. A mere trifle, a copy of a copy, I believe. Nothing of any particular note, beyond its historical curiosity. Certainly not connected to Miss Vance, I assure you." "And yet," Poirot continued, his voice softer, yet more piercing, "the lapis lazuli gate inscription. Did you perchance notice it on this trifle?" Lord Ashworth's smooth facade cracked just a fraction. He looked genuinely surprised, a flicker of unease in his eyes. "Lapis lazuli gate. I confess I'm not familiar with such an inscription. My provenance reports make no mention of it." Before he could recover, a liveried servant entered, bowing respectfully. "My lord, the housekeeper sent me to inquire about Miss Vance's last visit. She found a glove in the library and believes it belongs to the young lady who visited so frequently these past few weeks. A small red leather glove." Lord Ashworth's face flushed a deep crimson, not unlike the curtain in the miniature. "That will be all, Perkins. Dispose of it." His voice was sharper now, his composure finally broken. Lady Ashworth, from her corner, flinched visibly. Poirot merely inclined his head, a silent acknowledgment of the servant's inadvertent revelation. "So, nothing more substantial, and not connected to Miss Vance," Poirot mused, looking directly at Ashworth. "Yet a servant recalls frequent visits, and a red glove is misplaced. It seems, Lord Ashworth, that your red curtain of denial is rather transparent. The lapis lazuli gate on Miss Vance's canvas, and perhaps on your own, indicates not a whimsical flourish, but a very specific coded reference. A reference to something lost, and perhaps something found. And if I am not mistaken, it relates directly to that Medici painting Monsieur Thorne mentioned. The red curtain is not merely an artistic device, Hastings. It is a veil behind which a very valuable secret is concealed." Chapter 6. The Secret Society. The afternoon sun, struggling valiantly through the persistent cloud cover, cast long, spectral shadows across an abandoned, overgrown garden in Hampstead. Once, it must have been a place of beauty, but now crumbling statues lay half buried in nettles, and pathways were choked with weeds. The air was still, save for the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of the city, a perfect setting for uncovering forgotten secrets. "A most melancholic place, Hastings," Poirot observed, carefully avoiding a patch of particularly aggressive ivy. "Yet sometimes truth prefers to reside in the places forgotten by the world." Our journey to this desolate spot was prompted by the cryptic inscription Lapis Lazuli Gate, and further research into Eleanor Vance's fascination with historical art mysteries. Poirot, with his uncanny ability to connect seemingly disparate facts, had linked it to a defunct art society known as the Crimson Palette. This society, active in the late 19th century, was shrouded in scandal, specifically concerning the disappearance of a priceless Medici painting known as the Veil of Medusa. Our initial inquiries had led us to a dusty archive within an old, forgotten library, where an aged, stooped librarian with spectacles perched precariously on his nose reluctantly retrieved a collection of brittle newspaper clippings. He recalled the society, vaguely, a group of passionate but rather peculiar artists and connoisseurs. "The Crimson Palette," the librarian murmured, tapping a yellowed page. "Yes, they were quite the sensation for a time. Met in secret, you see. Believed art held mystical properties, hidden truths, and then the scandal. The missing Medici, they called it. The society disbanded not long after." He squinted at a list of names. "Ah, here we are. Notable members, Professor Alistair Vance, and, curiously, a certain Silas Blackwood, and even a Lord Ashworth in his younger, more rebellious days. The revelation that Blackwood, the theatrical director, and Professor Vance, Eleanor's tutor, were both members of this secretive society, alongside Lord Ashworth, sent a chill down my spine. The threads of the case, once scattered, were now tightening into a sinister knot. Poirot had arranged for us to meet Silas Blackwood in this very garden. He arrived, looking less the flamboyant director and more a man burdened by secrets, his usual theatricality muted by a palpable tension. "So, you were a member of the Crimson Palette, Monsieur Blackwood," Poirot stated, foregoing pleasantries. Blackwood stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "That was a lifetime ago, Monsieur Poirot. A youthful folly. We were idealists obsessed with lost art, with uncovering the true meaning behind masterpieces. Harmless amateur sleuthing, nothing more." "Harmless?" Poirot challenged. "And the disappearance of the Veil of Medusa? Was that also a youthful folly?" Blackwood visibly recoiled. "That was a terrible misunderstanding, a tragic loss, certainly. But none of us were involved in any criminal activity. We believed the painting was a copy, not the original. We were trying to prove it." He wrung his hands, a gesture I hadn't seen from the usually composed director. "Eleanor, she had a fascination with that painting, you know. She kept asking about it, said she was close to finding something, a clue to its true whereabouts." "And the lapis lazuli gate?" Poirot pressed. Blackwood paled. That was a private jest among us, a reference to the gate of a mythical city of artists from an obscure text we studied. It was meant to symbolize a hidden entrance to forgotten knowledge, to the true nature of art. Only a few of us knew it. So, Miss Vance, a student of Professor Vance, had knowledge of a secret society and a code word known only to its inner circle, including yourself and Lord Ashworth. And this society was linked to a stolen masterpiece she was actively investigating. Poirot summarized, his voice cold. "It seems, Monsieur Blackwood, that your red curtain of a play provided not merely a backdrop for theatre, but a very real stage for a much older drama of deceit. Eleanor was not simply an aspiring actress or artist, Hastings. She was an intrepid investigator on the verge of lifting the veil on a crime that involved all three of these men. And someone, fearing that revelation, silenced her forever." Chapter 7. The Unmasking. The evening air in Poirot's Baker Street flat was thick with anticipation. The gas lamps cast a warm, steady glow, highlighting the tension etched on the faces of the assembled suspects. Poirot, meticulously arranged in his favorite armchair, regarded each person in turn with an almost surgical precision. Lord Ashworth sat stiffly, his aristocratic composure barely maintained. Professor Alistair Vance looked drawn and pale, his usual eccentricities replaced by a profound weariness. Silas Blackwood fidgeted with a handkerchief, his theatrical bluster entirely gone. Even Miss Vivian Holloway, whose presence Poirot had specifically requested, seemed subdued, her usual vivacity replaced by a nervous watchfulness. I, as always, sat ready with my notebook, trying to keep pace with Poirot's extraordinary deductions. "Mes chers amis," Poirot began, his voice calm yet resonating with authority. "We are here to unravel the enigma of Miss Eleanor Vance, a young woman of considerable talent, a fervent admirer of truth, and, tragically, a victim of her own intrepid spirit." He paused, allowing the silence to deepen. Miss Vance was not merely an aspiring actress, nor simply a painter. She was a detective, using her artistic skills to uncover a grand deception. The red curtain in her flat, the theatre program, the Venetian red pigment, the lapis lazuli gate inscription, all were not random clues, but carefully placed pieces of a mosaic she was constructing, a mosaic that told the story of the Veil of Medusa. Lord Ashworth scoffed, but Poirot merely raised a hand. The Medici painting, stolen decades ago, was initially dismissed by many as a copy. But Eleanor, guided by Professor Vance's expertise in historical techniques, began to suspect otherwise. She believed the true original had been replaced with an elaborate forgery years ago, and the Arts Society, the Crimson Palette, was at the heart of the initial switch. Professor Vance cleared his throat nervously. "Eleanor was very passionate, Monsieur Poirot, but she was perhaps too imaginative." "Au contraire, Professor," Poirot retorted, his eyes flashing. "She was precisely imaginative enough. She discovered that the original Veil of Medusa contained a unique identifier, a specific shade of Venetian red used in the drapery of the figure, a shade that could only be recreated with particular rare pigments. It was a kind of artistic fingerprint." He then turned to the unfinished portrait found in Eleanor's studio. This painting, The Girl Behind the Red Curtain, was not merely an homage. It was Eleanor's attempt to recreate a portion of the original frieze, Veil of Medusa, using the very same unique Venetian red. She was forging a forgery, if you will, to expose the truth. The red curtain in her painting was a direct challenge, a mirror to the specific drapery in the lost Medici piece. "And the lapis lazuli gate," I interjected, eager for clarification. "Ah, the lapis lazuli gate," Poirot said, a glint in his eyes. "A delightful touch. It was, as Monsieur Blackwood confirmed, a code for a secret entrance to artistic knowledge. But Eleanor discovered its true significance. It was a cryptic reference to the location where the original painting was hidden. A hidden chamber in a villa once owned by the Medici family, long since converted into an archive, with a gate adorned with lapis lazuli tiles. She found this in an obscure, forgotten journal of a former Crimson Palette member. A collective gasp went through the room. Eleanor was planning to present her reconstructed Veil of Medusa alongside her irrefutable evidence of the pigment and the journal to expose the decades-long fraud. Poirot continued, his voice now rising. She had discovered that Lord Ashworth, whether wittingly or unwittingly, possessed the subsequent forged copies, which he displayed as originals. But her target was not merely the exposure of a stolen painting. Her target, mes amis, was the very architect of the original deception. He paused, allowing his gaze to sweep across the faces of the three men. "Someone among you, fearing exposure, fearing ruin, silenced her, and the method of her collapse, the lack of struggle, suggests someone she knew, someone she trusted implicitly, someone who could offer her tea, laced with a subtle, undetectable poison, one that mirrored the effects of a sudden, natural collapse." The tension in the room was almost unbearable. All eyes turned to Poirot, waiting for the final, devastating pronouncement. The red curtain was about to be pulled back entirely. Chapter 8. The Grey Cells, Prevail. The silence in Poirot's flat was absolute, a palpable weight pressing down upon everyone. Poirot allowed it to linger, savoring the moment before the final, inevitable unveiling. He straightened a small vase on the mantelpiece, his movements precise, deliberate. The clues, when viewed through the lens of psychology and human nature, coalesce into a single, undeniable truth, Poirot declared, his voice ringing with quiet authority. Eleanor Vance was indeed recreating a portion of the Veil of Medusa. The unique Venetian red, which only Monsieur Griggs could supply, was essential. The lapis lazuli gate was her key to the original painting's resting place, and her intent was clear, to expose a monumental fraud. He looked directly at Lord Ashworth. "Your lordship, you were undoubtedly duped by a sophisticated forgery. You possessed a copy, perhaps even several, passed off as the original. You had a motive to silence Eleanor, fearing your reputation and fortune would be shattered by the revelation of your unwitting complicity in the art world's greatest scandal. But you are not the murderer." Ashworth slumped in his chair, relief warring with indignation. Poirot then turned to Silas Blackwood. "Monsieur Blackwood, you were a member of the Crimson Palette. You knew the secrets. You feared the revelation of your youthful involvement in an illicit art society and the taint of scandal. But your bluster, your theatricality, speaks of a man protecting a past, not orchestrating a present murder. You, too, are not the killer." Blackwood merely nodded, his face pale. "Which leaves us, mes amis," Poirot continued, his gaze now fixed upon Professor Alistair Vance, Eleanor's revered tutor, with the one person who possessed all the means, all the knowledge, and the most compelling, albeit deeply hidden, motive. Professor Vance visibly stiffened, his eyes widening in a mixture of fear and dawning comprehension. "Professor Vance," Poirot said, his voice now devoid of any warmth, "you were Eleanor's mentor, her guide in the world of art. You guided her to the very pigments, the very techniques she needed to recreate the Veil of Medusa. You knew of the Crimson Palette, of the lapis lazuli gate. You were the one who suggested her project was merely an homage, a whimsical exploration." Poirot rose and walked towards Professor Vance. But Eleanor's investigations led her to a truth far more profound than just a stolen painting. She discovered that the original Veil of Medusa was indeed stolen by the Crimson Palette decades ago, but the real crime, the greater deception, occurred afterwards. The original painting, once stolen, was never returned. Instead, you, Professor Vance, secretly replaced it with a second, even more brilliant forgery, selling the true masterpiece for your own immense profit years later, allowing the Medici mystery to continue and the subsequent forgeries to circulate among collectors like Lord Ashworth. Eleanor, with her meticulous eye and moral compass, uncovered your betrayal, not just of art history, but of her own trust. Professor Vance's face was ashen, all pretense crumbling. He attempted to speak, but only a choked gasp escaped. "The specific poison," Poirot pressed, "a rare, slow-acting compound, often used in old preservation techniques for delicate pigments, one that leaves few traces and mimics a natural collapse. Such a substance would be readily available in an artist's studio. You gave it to her in her tea, knowing her meticulous habits, knowing she trusted you. You killed her not to protect a stolen painting, but to protect your own deep-seated, ongoing fraud, a betrayal of the very art you claim to cherish." He held up the red curtain tassel. This, Eleanor left as a subtle clue. It was from a discarded, painted stage curtain used as a drop cloth in her studio, a color sample for the very Venetian red that sealed her fate, and a symbol of the deception she was about to pull back. The girl behind the red curtain was Eleanor herself, revealing the truth of the forgery within the forgery, and your treachery, Professor. The professor, defeated, finally broke. He buried his face in his hands, his body racked with silent sobs. The truth, like a final devastating brushstroke, had been laid bare. As the police, summoned by a discreet signal from Poirot, led Professor Vance away, the flat returned to its accustomed quiet. The little grey cells had triumphed once again. "Another case closed, Hastings," Poirot said, a sigh escaping him. But at what a cost? The greatest deceptions are often born not of grand schemes, but of the slow corruption of the soul, concealed behind the most exquisite facades. I looked at my friend, always marveling at his brilliant mind, his unwavering commitment